Hi, and welcome to the show. It's the Christine Joanna Hart Show. And today we're going to talk about different things. We're going to cover immigration and we're going to cover attitudes at the moment in the UK to what's happening. We've got a new Prime Minister come in, Andy Burnham. And so we're going to just go over these kind of issues. We're going to bring it into looking at it in a spiritual perspective. And I have my guest, the learned Brian Barrett, author. You know him, he's been on the channel before. And so we're going to bring him into the conversation. And so I wanted to start off by talking about a man that we're going to have on shortly, Ryan Bridges from Raise the Colours, and about he was taken to court by the people of Oxford about raising the colours, about using the Union Jack. And of course, now we've got the immigration camp, the refugee camp in Bicester and Piddington, and the people there don't want it. So what's going on with the British public? Why are we having immigration? From a higher perspective, from an eagle perspective, I brought Brian Barrett on to talk about these issues. Brian, welcome to the show.
Hi, Chris. Nice to see you again.
Yes, and you. So, how is it out there? You're over in Ukraine at the moment, dodging Russian bombs.
Yeah, sometimes it can be very frightening, obviously, especially when the house shakes or something like that. But apart from that, the Ukrainian people are very forthright and very determined. And literally, I don't think you could find a braver nation, honestly. I say that in all sincerity.
Right, right. Lovely. I'd hate to be there because what I see is they're dragging, I have a son who's 22 and they're dragging young men off the streets to go and fight, which is awful, really.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I think rule number one is in this day of communication. What you see may not necessarily be correct. Okay. Yeah.
Right.
We saw that during various aspects over the last 5 years. We had films from certain country where people were dropping on the floor, etc., etc., and patrols of vehicles allegedly full of dead bodies, etc., etc., which all turned out to be fundamentally flawed. I think that's the politest way of saying it. So when we're
Mm,
when we're watching the news and when we're absorbed in essentially something which is entertainment. I went
mm,
to a lecture by Steven Spielberg, and he asked quite an innocent question: "What's the difference between the news and Tom and Jerry?" Um, he got some really wonderfully artistic answers and some very academic answers. But the real answer is quite simple. They're both made for entertainment.
mm.
So when we're watching the news, you must understand, well, that's your background. You know yourself. If it bleeds, it leads. Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yes.
So, you know, there is, shall we say, there is a slight amount or more than a slight amount of editorial bias to make you watch the program.
Mm,
It's that simple. And because of that, you can't put your hand on your heart and say, well, this is authentic. At some stage, somebody has had an input to give you a message which may or may not be correct. Would you agree with
of
that?
course. Yes, of course, of course. It just doesn't seem that great. I mean, I'm glad I'm in the UK, even though the UK is, it seems odd at the moment. We are having a lot of refugees come in, and there is a housing crisis at the moment. And while I enjoy diversity, and it's not about skin color, it's not about race, it's really about, I think the country's too full unless they start
Okay.
building more
Can we just
houses.
move back? Can we just move
Yeah,
back? I mean,
sure.
I think this is one of the mantras. It's not about color and it's not about race. Okay. Yeah. Um, Obviously, being a philosopher, I would always examine statements like this. Okay. Because when I grew up in England, I'm quite old. when I grew up in England, it was predominantly white. Okay, yeah. You know, you can see
Mm.
pictures of London in the 1960s. You can see pictures of England in the 1960s. It was predominantly white. There were black people, but generally speaking, the majority was white. Then after the 80s, essentially more and more different ethnicities moved into our country. Now, countries like Poland, Japan, Hungary, they said, no, you know, we want our country to be our country. England has taken another variation on that. They've encouraged people to come here who essentially, a majority of them don't understand the West, probably have great animosity towards the West. You know, yet they're in our country. Now, I travel all over the world and I'm respectful for wherever I go. And the point being is that if I go to India, I obey their rules, I follow their creed and their codes. I'm a guest. Okay, end of story. Same with Thailand, same with the Philippines, same with everywhere, even with the Ukrainian place where is my home. I follow the rules. I understand I am in this country, but essentially I am a guest. So I do what is necessary. If I don't like a country, it's quite simple. I won't go there. Now, we're having immigration with people who are openly anti-West, and they're still being allowed to come into the country. That's fair enough. If you have a democracy, then you can stand people criticizing your democracy. But there's a very thin line between criticizing a democracy and hating that democracy and using violence towards it. And I don't care what color you are, if you've opted for violence against the country that you are a guest in, there is something fundamentally wrong in your ethos and behavior.
Yes, but don't you think in a way it's a judgment on the white race because we've lived in a way, we have our middle class areas, very white areas who are living in a state of idolatry. They have plenty, but they're not saying, look what God gave me. It's look what I have got for myself. They're not involved in prayer. They can be cliquey. They don't welcome outsiders. And they're living in this state. And God has said, well, hey, bring some outsiders. And now also your money, your home won't protect you from this. Isn't it God just saying, take that because you've been ignoring me? It's what it looks like, I have to say,
Okay,
from a distance.
I think the sensible way to look at it is like this. Way back 2000 years before Christ, Plato said we have two boats. One is driven by an experienced sea captain, the other one gives free beer. Which
Mm.
one do the public choose? The public choose free beer because that makes sense to them. And it's the same with political ideology. The political ideology seldom looks to the future. It always looks in the present moment. You can guarantee a lot of people have made a tremendous amount of money from immigration because otherwise they wouldn't be here. You know, it's a capitalist society. So people make money, and that money involves housing, hotels, etc., etc. I don't think God has very little to do with it. Seriously, I
Does
really
it
don't.
doesn't doesn't God use people? Like obviously you believe in jinn possession, etc. And jinn, we talked about serial killers, and because you've written a book on the jinn, etc. And you believe that our world is surrounded by, as you called it, the kaf. And you believe that in the case of, say, Kenneth Bianchi, who I met and interacted with, that it was a jinn, carrying out the murders, which I agree with. And so, don't you think that someone even more powerful than a jinn could use people to engineer things?
I think if you're going to blame any god, you would have to blame Mammon, which is the god of wealth, the god of accruing, the god of greed. Now, essentially, the god of greed is absolutely wonderful because he only promotes to you the advantages of the money. He doesn't actually tell you what you have to do to get the money, what part of yourself you have to sell to get the money. He just says to you, oh, this amount of money, you can get this, that, and the other with absolutely no concern. So if there is a God connected with chaos and money, then that God would be Mammon. And Mammon, again, is a very, very selfish God. You often hear it. People say, oh, I've changed jobs to earn more money to spend more time with the children. Never happens. They actually spend more time at work. That's how Mammon works. Mammon wants the energy. He's not interested in the money. He's interested in your energy that is given to him. Now, if we look at the situation from a purely occult situation angle, we are seeing many people in England annoyed. We're seeing frightened immigrants coming to our country. We're seeing people angry. This is an awful lot of energy. Where is that energy going to? Well, that energy, if we look at this from a purely esoteric angle, is going to a god like Mammon, a god that only believes in essentially accruing. And as for everything else, it doesn't really care as long as it gets its energy. So, from that aspect, yes. But what is Mammon? Is Mammon a universal god, or is it an archetype which is within us? The jury is out, but the fact of the matter is the what you are describing is a hankering for wealth, regardless of the consequence, and that essentially is Mammon.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think the English have certainly lost their way in that respect. And also, don't you think that there is an antidote to feeling safe, to living in a way that's right, to live in a state of connection to God? And of course, we're all a bit confused at the moment as to what God we're supposed to pray to. I mean, there's so many on offer. There's Shiva. There's Buddha, there is, although not technically a god, there's Allah, there's Christ, there's Yahweh. So how do people know where to tap in and who to pray to?
Well, I mean, essentially, the thing is that there are so many gods because there are so many different people. If you go to India, there's literally millions of gods and there's literally millions of people. What you have to assimilate too is essentially what psychologists would call as your internal script. What you've been brought up to believe, what you've been brought up to understand, which is correct. For example, if we take this formulation and we say, look at history, which is the best way to judge any kind of worship and what it entails. If we look at the Vikings, they openly worshipped Thor. Now, Thor was before the Vikings started invading countries. However, Thor was the god they used to invade countries. Valhalla, hammer of the gods, destruction, accruing. So, from the Viking perspective of young men who were disenfranchised, who wanted money, women, and gold, thought England and violence fell into line. Now, if we go further and we look at, say, the time of the Raj and the British Empire, the humble baby Jesus was used as a lever to justify the atrocities that the British did in India. So, this is when we're talking about gods, we're not really talking about gods. We're talking about how you are within inside of you and what is associated with your ethos, your philosophical worldview, and how you are as a person. Ironically, people who get into Satanism will probably read something like Anton LaVey. And realistically, if you read Anton LaVey, it's pretty down-to-earth atheism, if anything. Satan is seen as nothing more than, if you wish, a concept.
Mm.
Very similar to Buddhism, to put it bluntly. So realistically, whatever your transitional script is, whatever your harmony is, whatever your belief is as a sort of child and the system that you were brought up with is generally speaking the God that you go for. When one gets older, they choose a God which fits more with their personality and lifestyle. Like, during the 80s and the 90s, pretty much everybody turned Buddhist, where now most people are atheist and they won't even profess to be humanist. They just profess to be atheist and don't believe in something, which is fair enough, But the point is no matter what God you choose, it should be a God that makes you a better human being. It shouldn't make you into a destructive individual who wants to oppress and kill people in your God's name. You know, this to me is more political gerrymandering of religious ethos as opposed to people deciding, oh, my God told me to kill somebody. Um, I think this is your problem. It doesn't really matter what the God is. It matters whether or not it makes you a better person and whether or not you can create a harmonious world through this belief system. Ironically, we're very much in the realm of Nietzsche, where Nietzsche says if you take God out of the equation, you end up with the intellectual elite and the herd. And that's essentially where we are at the moment, that essentially all our ideas of God and of harmony and developed spiritually have been pretty much destroyed via the media. And we're left with the intellectual elite and the herd. There are still people who believe in a God. There are people who are religious, but they probably represent 20-30% of the population. And out of that 20-30%, you've probably only got anywhere between 6 and 10% that are actual practitioners. I mean, sort of you are saying that you believe in a God, etc., etc., but it's what do people do to actually assimilate towards that God? It's all right saying, oh, I'm this, I'm that, and the other, but if you're not prepared to put in the work and if you're not prepared to understand what your commitment to an ideology means and how it affects other people, then realistically, it doesn't matter what God you get, you're going to be fairly awful.
You're going to what? Sorry.
You're going to be fairly awful.
Right, right. So say I, like a lot of people in England, say I was committed to the God of the Bible, the Old Testament God, say Yahweh, for instance. What would I do to connect with Yahweh? Just get a candle and stare into it and say, hey,
Well, I don't
hey.
want to correct you, but the original God of the Bible from the Bibles before they were edited into what we see today, the God was a completely different name. It was I forget, but it was something like sh
El
hold on,
Shaddai?
El Shaddai. Yeah, El Shaddai. Yeah, he was known as El Shaddai. So, the Yahweh is, you have to understand the complexity of Yahweh. Under Nebuchadnezzar, Jews were taken to Mesopotamia to help run businesses and accounts and things like this. And while they were in Mesopotamia, they came in contact with the pantheon, which is associated with Sumer and Mesopotamia. And part of that pantheon was a desert god called Yahweh. They then took Yahweh back with them and ushered him in as their God, neatly forgetting that he is a desert God, neatly forgetting that there is actually a Mrs. God. And they constructed this belief system to fit into the Jewish identity. And essentially, that's really how Yahweh got into the Bible. So
And so
realistically,
who was El Shaddai? Did he get forgotten?
El Shaddai, I mean, it's you've really got to research El Shaddai. I came across him by accident because I was looking at a Bible which was something like 200 or 300 years old, and I noticed that there he was in it. So I'm not a Christian, so I'm not that, if you like, sparked up on Christian ideology, but I do know that El Shaddai was realistically the God they spoke of about 300 or 400 years ago. And we are allowed to sort of muse over Yahweh. But realistically, the very fact that we don't understand the roots of these gods illustrates a great deal. As I said, Yahweh is a desert god. He wasn't even part of the big pantheon. So,
So what was the big pantheon at that point?
well, you're looking at like Enel, Enki,
Oh, I
Tiamat,
see.
sort of
Right.
Marduk. You're looking at these guys, these gods who were the ultimate.
Aren't they Anunnaki?
Well, the Anunnaki means those who came down from the heavens, and essentially, it's so open to translation. It's not. I don't think there's any accurate sort of translation from it. The closest I think it represents is that the ruling class used to live in the ziggurats, and occasionally they would come down to the oiks, us, the goyim, whatever you want to call us, the working class. And of course, when these gods came down, because that's how they declared themselves, they were declared as the gods that come down from heaven, but literally they just came down from the ziggurats. And I think that actually fits the bill much more than alien spacecraft and such like that. It seems to make more sense to me. And as for the so-called Anunnaki, I've read recently that it just pretty much translates to the Guardian. Now,
Right.
if you're coming down from the heavens, from your ziggurat, and you're going to meet the goyim or the working class or whatever or the proletariat, you're going to have guardians with you who were called the Anunnaki. And then over the thousands and thousands and thousands of years, people have written their own interpretation as to what they believe these iconic religious figures represent. But you have to understand that that politics and religion, especially from this time, were so intertwined. For example, the Roman leaders declared themselves as gods. So it wasn't that unusual that your leader would say that I'm your God. Yeah. So
Mm.
the Egyptian pantheon as well, the rulers of the pharaohs would declare themselves as gods. So you have to be very, very careful putting your money on a lot of ancient religions, because a lot of the so-called gods were literally just humans calling themselves gods, and we see it today. I mean, there are people, especially wealthy people, who will say, "I'm a god, don't touch me. I've made more wealth than anybody else. I'm this, I'm the other." Well, missing the fact that they are getting old and getting senile like everybody else, where one would presume if you were a god, you would be omnipresent, never age, and you wouldn't have to say I'm a god. People would know you were a god, one would presume.
Oh yeah, exactly. But what about Christ? Where does he come into that? Because Christ announced to everybody that he was the Son of God, meaning the Son of Yahweh. I think he made that clear, didn't he? That it was
I don't
the
think I
God
don't
of the
think
Old
I don't
Testament.
think there's anything clear about Jesus Christ. Seriously.
Right.
I mean, Jesus Christ at best is a composite. I mean, seriously, at best is a composite. I mean, what does really Jesus represent? Because, when we ask this question, we encounter massive problems. The Jesus Christ presented in the canonical Gospels is part of the Christian theology, and he's given the name Christos, which really seems sort of like, oh, this is his name. It's not. It just simply means the anointed one or the divine principles. This isn't something that's made up. This is taken from the Greek, meaning Christos, anointed. Blavatsky in the 1800s certainly made a meal of this and said that, whatever you're calling the Christ, you have to understand what the Christ is. And, the Greek lineage to the language is really important. So, when you're asking who is Jesus, you have to understand what you're actually talking about. I mean, are we looking at the historical Jesus? If we're looking at the Son of God, well, really, Jesus is a solar God. With close to Hadrian Wall, they found a old Roman villa, and part of the tiled floors was Jesus as Apollo. So this really demonstrates the link between the solar God and the what we understand as Jesus Christ. If you follow the Catholic religion, the sun symbol is absolutely throughout everything within the Catholic Church. Everything, looks like a sun, because essentially Jesus is a solar god. And if you look at the solar gods, Mithras, Horus, Jesus, they've all got the same MO. They've all got 12 disciples. They've all raised from the dead. So when I say that Jesus is a composite, if you can find pretty similar stories about other solar gods, which are similar to the God that you understand, then you have to come to the conclusion at some stage somebody has introduced an idea based on another idea. It doesn't matter what religion you support. They're all constructs. They're all the workings of man. Me as an occultist, I would certainly never defend what I believe, because realistically, somebody has written it down. And if somebody has written it down, then they've written it down with an agenda. After years of study and understanding the text, yes, I can come to a different idea, or I can approve an idea. But really, in the cold light of day, we're looking at primarily a construct. And it's very much the same with the historical Jesus. I mean, the wonderful presentation of a peasant carpenter wandering around Galilee with lots of humble people. But when you actually examine Galilee, the picture is considerably more complicated. Galilee was like a massive Greek port. I say Greek port because essentially there was such a mishmash of language that the anchor language would be Greek. So they would speak Greek. So straight away we understand that Jesus would have spoke Greek. Then if we look at the original Greek translation of what Jesus was, or Jesus's father was, which I believe is Joseph, they say tekton. And that's not some humble carpenter working with wood. This is an artisan working with buildings, and it's highly specialized work. So, it's fairly obvious that the Jesus, the man, was probably came from a reasonably wealthy background. I mean, this is actually illustrated because he rides into Damascus on a donkey, which sounds really primitive, but realistically, the donkey from that time was probably the same as having a Porsche. They were a beast of burden, but they were also very expensive. So, so we have to be very careful when we're jumping in when deciding what Jesus is and what he represents. He's
So
certainly
what is a solar god then? Because I'm sure the audience haven't heard of solar gods and what they are to
right. Okay,
humanity in relation to
a
human.
solar god is one that is directly related to the sun. Yeah. For
Mhm.
example, the last god to enter the Egyptian pantheon, ironically, was Horus, which is, of course, another solar god. Now, the at the time of Jesus, many Romans did not worship Jesus. They worshiped Mithra, who is a bull, and the bull is also a solar god. Hence, this is why in the Bible there's lots of stories about not making graven images and not worshipping the bull and all this kind of thing, because essentially it directly relates to another solar entity, which of course is Mithras. But like I said, it's very hard to find out what Jesus is. I mean, realistically, if we look at Jesus and we take Jesus out of it, he there's some really interesting questions. For example, in the Garden of Gethsemane, they bring a cohort of men to arrest him. A cohort is round about 500. So why do they need 500 men to arrest one guy and maybe half a dozen of his mates or a dozen of his mates? Well, there's obviously more than just a dozen. Not only that, they are ready to cause trouble. I mean, in the story of Gethsemane, I think it's Peter strikes one of the Roman soldiers with his sword, and Jesus repairs his ear for him. So, if you look at it from that, Jesus is not your meek and mild guy. Moreover, when he is actually destroyed as a human, he's killed by the state. He is murdered as one king of the Jews, and secondly, as a criminal. The crucifixion was reserved for criminals. So, it's history is not often what is written, but what is shown. So if 500 guys turn up to arrest Jesus and then they crucify him, I think the good money is on, he's probably quite a bad dude.
You've called Jesus bad on my channel.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the original sort of Greek, when Jesus is arrested, um, he says, I'm not a laiste in the original Greek. A laiste is somebody who abducts children.
but he's saying he's not. Oh, I see your meaning. So, do you believe that Jesus was a magician or anything supernatural? You think he was a
I think
normal
there's
dude?
lots of Jesuses, seriously.
Hmm.
Like Robin Hood. I think there was a Jesus the magician. I mean, there's there certainly was a connection because we have to look at Simon Magus. Yeah, sort of he was a magician who knew the apostles. So, I know it doesn't automatically follow that Jesus was a magician, but the fact they knew these guys and the fact the Romans said that what they did was fairly miraculous, you have to understand these guys predominantly were about attracting people, and the best way to attract people is to put on a really amazing show. And that's what they did. They would stand up in the marketplace, do an amazing show, pull converts into their cult. Everybody's happy. The converts got a show, they get the converts, and then they move on to the next town. This is roughly how it worked. It's nothing like the biblical image that Hollywood portrays. So, but like I
Hmm.
said,
Hmm.
you know, the 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 Jesus we know is there's so many of them. I mean, for example, you must have heard of Isha. Have you heard of Isha?
Yes.
Isha in India. Yeah,
Yes,
in India. Well,
I have.
essentially, a Russian guy called Novik was injured in one of the wars, and he spoke Tibetan, clever guy, and part of his recovery, he went sort of through the Tibetan wilderness, and he found a Tibetan monastery with evidence of somebody who came from Palestine or that area and learnt the Indian tradition. Now, for years, this was just thought of as I think it's Novik just cashing in and making some money. But sometime, I think in the sort of like 70s, 80s, the Indian government actually pursued this and found it to be true. And in Rishikesh, you can actually visit the Jesus cave, a cave where he stayed. So, there's another Jesus. The church vehemently deny the proof of Jesus in India. However, the documentation is there. The Indian government say it's true. So, you pay your money, you take your choice.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So if you want to pray to Jesus, what do you do?
Well, no, you've got plenty to go from. You've got Isha, you've got the guy who was the magician, you've got the guy who was probably fairly criminal. I mean, sort of like there are so many parts of the Bible which realistically are just so dodgy. I mean, for example, Ananias and Sapphira, they don't give all their money to Jesus and hold the money back. And the Bible says that they die after each other. What do they actually mean by die after each other? Do they mean God was so angry with them, he killed them, or do they mean Jesus and his mob murdered them for holding the money back? Remember, we're talking about a time where there was no police as such.
Hmm.
The Romans were in charge of the citadel, as they would call it. They weren't interested in internal politics. If Jews were killing one another, it wasn't really part of their show. So I think it's highly likely that if you're doing a cult, then you can pretty much wrap it up because no one's going to stop you. And
Hmm. Well,
there is evidence of the Jesus cult. They found graves. with early Jews supporting the Christos. But then again, who is the Christos? You know?
I found reading the Psalms, I had a magical experience. I was in a very bad situation and I prayed the Psalms. Somebody gave me certain Psalms to pray, and I can't remember. I know one was Psalm 23, 71, 91, perhaps. And it worked out for me, which I went out to a nature reserve and really prayed it deeply and called out for El Elyon and two angels, Sitael, Haniel, and I was answered, everything turned out okay, which was a small miracle for me. So I do have faith in the Psalms and parts of the Bible that they have magic in them.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going back to the Psalms, many are attributed to David, who is conveniently placed around 1000 BC. But you know, once again, there's a bit of a cloud written on it. I mean, a lot of them were taken from sort of Eastern religious poetry. A lot of them were like Canaanite and Ugaric, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and other, cultures of that era. So when we're looking at what is Psalms, they are definitely a, a collection. I mean, Psalm 104, it's literally the great hymn to Atum, the Egyptian god. So, I mean, that
104.
that that doesn't mean, yeah, that doesn't mean to say that they don't work. It just means to say they may not be what they think they are. Because you find them
Well,
in the
mine,
Bible doesn't mean to say that they're not sort of like great psychological and magical works.
oh right. Well, mine, I've got it here. I was given to it by a magician in a group. One was Psalm 23. Um, And then apparently the password for the psalm, they've given me something which I think is Jewish. O El Jehovah Yah Nupachil, yada yada. Then Psalm 72, which mentions Sheba, and then Psalm 91, which talks about El Shaddai and Elyon. So yeah, interesting. Would they be written by David?
Yeah, they're pretty much written by David. Well, they're attributed to David. Yeah. Essentially, it's very much Near Eastern symbolic language. Essentially, it's the Lord is my pre shepherd is Psalm 23. Um, Essentially, again, if you look at the Lord is my shepherd, it's an initiation into the inner journey, pasture, water, restoration, right path, valley of death, confrontation with the enemies, anointing, divine dwelling. Literally, it's an initiatory journey through the death of darkness or something that is dark. But that's just my interpretation as a magician because I can see the structure there. That's what
Well,
that's what they're
yeah.
talking about.
So what God are they praying to when they say the Lord is my shepherd? Who's the Lord?
Well, exactly. I mean, sort of like it could be Mesopotamian, it could be anything, people are very precious about this, but if Jesus was a construction, then the Bible was certainly a construction. I mean, we know that from the Council of Nicaea, you know, but I'm not saying that what I believe in is not a construction as well. Literally everything is a construction. The money that's in your wallet is a construction. The only thing that gives it value is your belief in it.
Hmm.
So that illustrates how powerful belief is, so
Hmm.
I think that's another important thing to remember that the belief in a system is incredibly powerful and can be incredibly life-changing.
So, what are we to think of ourselves? That we are a bunch of mammals on a little planet? Do we have a father that we can ask for help for, or are we on our own and just created by mistake?
I would say be very suspicious about organized religion, yeah, because it's so contradictory. Our God is perfect. Oh, you've not worn a headscarf. Oh, you're going to have to lose your head. Perfect God, yeah. Our God is
Mm,
perfect. Oh, you've got to chop the end of your skin off on your penis because, after all, God made a mistake again. If you look at a lot of the gods, they tie very much into tribal law, sort of
mm.
supposed to be divinely written. Well, if they're divinely written, then why are they so violent? Why are they so myopic? Why is the god so vengeful? These are all human traits, in my opinion. Does really a god want to slaughter everything that's put in front of it? Well, apparently, Yahweh does. So, these are serious questions you've got to ask yourself. For the religious structure to sound so vicious and human, surely it's nothing to do with a god. It's just to do with a bunch of humans writing a do and don't do or will kill you guidebook. Do you not think?
Yeah, perhaps, but I do know that they work for me. The Psalm, reading them work for me. And
I don't doubt that
you
for a
know,
minute. The words of power, regardless where you get them from, are very effective. Whether or not you're praying to Yahweh is another thing because the Psalms are incredibly old, and of course, we don't know who David's playing to either. So, that's another issue. If we're going back to David's day, then sort of the the worship was very pantheistic. Many gods were worshipped at the same time. So,
who did David pick though? Who
well, we
was
don't we,
he?
we don't know. We don't know. I mean, so like,
Right.
we're told by the established religions that he was the one and only true God. But I mean, like I said, everything's written by humans. You've got to be very careful when they start coming out with sweeping statements like this.
Mm-hmm.
And realistically, if you went back to David's day, I think one, you'd be actually quite surprised how small his kingdom was
Mm.
in reality. What we understand as king, we would probably call CEO now in our world because of the massive difference. Do you understand? In
Yes.
in societies. I mean, if you look back at recent history, Agincourt and stuff like that, France was not France as we understand it. It was many regions. Same with England. England was many, many regions. And ironically, most of these regions before Christianity came along had their own individual worship as well as their own individual king. So, I think that illustrates really the difficulty in finding a true religion or a true God or a true meaning is that the history doesn't allow us to do that because
Yes, which smacks of us being kept in a box and those that control the planet, the elite as they are termed, want to keep us in a state where we're not connected to divinity, wants to keep us in an animal kingdom, which it is, people are focused on wealth, they're abusive to others. This
I mean
it's
there,
not
there
a
is
nice
there is
place to
no
be,
change.
really.
No, but there's no change there. You're not discussing anything that's changed. I mean, if we went back to medieval England, the warlords were fighting each other all the time in the name of Jesus.
Mm,
It's not something we've just suddenly picked up. Like I said, if your religious ethos is telling you to go kill everybody, I'd be very suspicious what type of God it is. You know, it's sort of like when
Yeah.
when you read these biblical stories, or or even sort of mythologies, the God is always so wonderfully violent. It's like,
Mm.
and intolerant, and just really just a nasty piece of work.
Oh, totally, totally.
And I think that
Just to
fits in.
say,
Yeah, sorry.
I think we've run out of time with the studio. I can see it flashing a little red light.
Okay.
So would you like to come back again to talk more about this? Because I know the listeners really like it and it's been an interesting show. Even though we haven't come to any conclusions how to reach God, perhaps we should just light a white candle and
Well, I
call out for
mean,
Father. I don't know.
the thing is, it's like I said to you, you have to find the God that you assimilate with, it's the one that is you, sort of like if you have a God that's telling you to do this, that, and the other, then it's definitely of human construction. If
Mm,
you finding a God that allows you to be a better person and encourages you to be a better person, and be more harmonious in the world, then the chances are that that's probably a more genuine God. It's
yeah, you're right.
anything that doesn't come with a massive rule book. It's pretty safe to say that this is probably quite a divine entity. But I mean, Buddhism fell under the same trap. The original Buddhism had three rules. I forget what they were. Now there's books of rules to do with Buddhism, So,
Mm.
you
It's
know, so,
crazy. Maybe it's infiltrated by something. I just want to bring on something. My friend has a company called Waterfly and makes these awesome. She sent me one and I can't stop using it. Now, I know everyone's carrying a rucksack on their back, and I had one and I was using my son's one he used for school. And this is made of like it's a kind of silky material. I'll leave a link below, but they are absolutely awesome. They come in different colors and they're trendy and they look cool. You look like you're kind of hiking in Tibet or something, and they can look glamorous or they can look hippie-ish. And you can just put them like, take them to a restaurant with an evening dress or casual gifts. They're not like the school ones, so we don't have to look like we're trying to be young. So there they are. The water really gorgeous. I just thought I'd share that actually.
yeah, I don't
Um,
think it'd look out of place on the King's Road, would it?
Sorry?
I don't think it'd look
No,
out of
they
place on
won't.
the King's Road.
They'll look fine. And also anybody that wants to make donations to the channel for walking therapy for me, I was hit twice by a car on my knee. So walking therapy is a donation of the time. So just look in my bio if you want to do that. And thank you for Brian Barrett coming onto the channel, author and scholar Brian Barrett. Thank you for coming on and educating us, and hope you come back soon. Um, and thank you for listening, everybody. And any questions and any subjects you'd like to be featured on the show, just leave in the box below, leave in the comments section. I'm always there replying. And any questions for Brian that you have, just leave them below. So thank you, Brian, for coming on over there, dodging bombs.
Okay. Thanks for
So
having
thank you
me.
for coming.
See you soon. Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Thank you, Brian. Take good care.